Mesdames et messieurs,
The greatest festival of our contemporary society, the Olympic Games, is about to begin.
This is gonna be close.
Oh! They're all completely gassed! They've given it everything on the global bucket! Oh, yeah! No! Oh!
Brilliant. But that is an Olympic championship.
Ready?
Hello and welcome to another episode of Keep the Flame Alive, the podcast for fans of the Olympics and Paralympics. If you love the games, we are the show for you. I am your host, Jill Jaracz, joined as always by my lovely co-host, Alison Brown. Alison, hello, how are you?
So the last time I think I mentioned a dream that I had, it involved you and I on a roller coaster in Ouray. Last night I had a dream that I was competing in the Imagine Olympics, where you
Ooh.
had to imagine yourself competing in something.
Keep going. I'm here for this.
And I can't remember what I was supposed to be imagining, but I was competing against actor James Norton, who now is in House of Guinness and has been in a lot of other things. I don't think I won, but I did end up dating James Norton. So I think I ended up winning after all.
It's a different kind of podium, I guess.
He's very tall.
Do you remember anything about how the Imagine Olympics worked?
Yes.
'Cause-
So you stood there on a stage that you were zapped into like a transporter from Star Trek, and you imagined stuff, and the judges and audience could see what you were imagining.
Oh my gosh, this is so awesome.
So obviously didn't win a medal, but got a really good-looking, tall, handsome boyfriend there out of it.
Wow. I love this concept. I want to hear what people would imagine in the Imagine Olympics. This is fantastic. And the fact that you just stood there and your brain just got projected onto a screen.
No, it didn't get projected in the screen.
Oh.
It got projected into the air over your head like a
Oh
thought
my
bubble.
gosh.
Oh, yeah.
That is awesome. More awesome than this whole thing.
I think what this whole thing has taught me, and we will have to keep this in mind for Milan especially, do not eat cake right before bed.
All the cake, listeners, all the cake. I will make sure we are stocked with cake. I am here for this.
So on to better stories.
Better stories. Well, it is always nice when someone is simpatico with our mission to tell all kinds of stories from the games. So we are excited to talk with Doug Levy, author of the book Hero Redefined, Profiles of Olympic Athletes Under the Radar. The book contains some amazing stories you may not have known, or athletes who, for some reason or another, made our collective conscious for our games, and then they fell off the radar. So we talk with Doug about some of those stories. Take a listen. Doug Levy, you are the author of Hero Redefined, Profiles of Olympic Athletes Under the Radar. Thank you so much for being on. Why this book and why now?
Well, it's interesting. We're talking at a time where in our country there's a ton of division and strife and enmity, and I really wanted to write a book that was uplifting for one thing. And as for why now, we're right in the middle of another upcoming Olympic Games, and we have Los Angeles in a couple of years hosting its third Summer Olympic Games. And I've always been fascinated by the Olympic movement. I love that it's about getting people together from all over the world for the right reasons. So that was a theme for me. And then I'm a big fan of looking for the everyday heroism that's out there. And it occurred to me that with Olympic athletes, we fixate a lot on the winners and the medal stand folks, and they deserve it. They're fantastic and they're elite, and I get it. But oh my gosh, there's so many great stories if you peel back a layer or two. And that's what I wanted to do with this book.
Speaking of, a Summer Olympics has 10,000 plus athletes. How did you choose? Who were you looking for, and how did you choose the ones on your list? And What did you start with, and how did you whittle that down?
Oh, it's a great series of questions. So I have to acknowledge that one of the athletes who really triggered all this in my brain is Gabrielle Anderson Shias. She's actually a 50-year-long resident of Sun Valley, but back in 1984, if you can believe this, it was the first ever Olympics with a women's marathon, and she ran that for Switzerland, her native country, and she was 39 at the time. So, that's pretty old for an Olympic marathoner. She didn't expect to win that race, but she was a very good runner. I mean, she was in the 225 world. If you're a marathoner and you tell someone you can run it in 2 hours and 25 minutes, that's pretty darn good. So she expected to be in the top 10 or 15, but she ran into unbelievable heat, smog, and then atypical humidity in Los Angeles on that August day of 1984. And get this, in the first ever women's Olympic marathons, there were 5 water stations. Any of the three of us run a 10K next week, we're probably going to have 6 water stations. So 5 in that first ever women's Olympic marathon. And for reasons she can't even explain, she missed the last one. So she got incredibly dehydrated, and she staggered into the Olympic Stadium in Los Angeles that day. And I don't want to spoil what's in chapter 2 of the book, but you read about what happened with her and what she did next. And she was an inspiration to me in writing this book. And then, to your question, the other one was a relay runner named Manteo Mitchell for the United States. And he was in London in 2012. And he had the honor of starting off the USA 4x400 meter relay team in that Olympics in the semifinals. And everything was going well for 200 meters. And then he hears a snap, and he has to think about what he's going to do with 3 teammates waiting for him. And I remember reading a little snippet about him in a tiny part of the newspaper and thinking, holy crap, what a story this is. And so I filed those things away. I went and had a long career. And then when I got to the point of wanting to write this book, those were the 2 athletes I reconjured. And to the rest of your question, I did a lot of research. I wanted to find athletes who typically didn't win medals, but did other things I found heroic. And candidly, I didn't go back in the book any further than 1960. And that's only because I wanted to have folks who were alive and well and could participate in the retelling of these stories. And just mathematically, you go back before 1960, it's hard to find people who are alive and well and walking around the planet. So that was a limiting factor. But so you'll find in the book stories from 1960 all the way up to 2022.
So in the book, you do talk to most of these people that you're able to talk to. How was that reception? You talk a little bit about the book, but how is it just on a personal level in terms of you reaching out to them, and what did they say?
I love the question because I'm a first-time author. So I consider myself someone who's respectful and comes across well. But for these athletes in the book, I was a nobody, right? I mean, they didn't have to talk to me. They didn't have to retell their stories. And in some cases, they weren't easy stories to talk about. And I will forever be grateful to all the athletes in this book who trusted me to just tell their stories with accuracy and candor and hopefully an even handedness. And I have let all the athletes know, hey, this isn't a gotcha book I'm about to write. This is retelling stories that I hope will be interesting to the reading public. But they had to put their trust and faith and confidence in me, and all of them did. And they did so with grace, and I'll always salute them for that.
One of the interesting elements of the book is that you don't just talk to the athletes, you talk to families and coaches and other people. So an incredible amount of work went into writing the book and writing each chapter. When did you start working on this?
This is about a 2-year odyssey from start to finish. I'll say that. I mean, if you're putting this in terms of a birth, I conceived this idea in the spring of 2023, and we birthed it in late January of 2025. So, to your question, it was obviously over 100 interviews with all the athletes in their inner circles and a lot of research. But that's the kind of stuff I love. I love digging and finding out information, and I love to talk to people about their stories. So, frankly, I didn't consider that the slog part of the book. There were a lot of other parts of the book that were eye openers for me beyond the researching and interviewing facet.
What are some of those what?
Well, I'm a writer. I have a career in journalism and government affairs and doing a lot of writing for myself and for people. So putting together the manuscript for the book, it's not that I'd done it hundreds of times, but I felt like I could do that. And then when I got to that point in January 2024, that's when all the eye-opening and learning occurred, because the editing process and the fact-checking process and the photo licensing process and all these things that go into these books that we read and consume and take for granted, I learned a lot about what that involves. I have a brand new admiration for anyone who's written a book, because it's a thicket of work you go through. But I was really grateful that I went through it, because I could feel secure that this book had been checked and rechecked and the facts were the facts. So those were good things, but they were eye openers for me.
Who was the hardest to track down?
Oh, definitely the athlete who is in chapter 4 of the book, and his name's John Stephen Aquari, and he's a character and a half. He's 85. He lives in the African nation of Tanzania, and it just so happened that my wife and I were traveling to Tanzania because we'd always wanted to go to Africa and go on safari trips and see wildlife up close and personal. But I hadn't been able to find Mr. Aquari through the normal channels. I mean, I went through Olympic committees and sports governing bodies, and, I was striking out a lot, to use a baseball term. And I asked the company that we were working with on the travel plans, Go to Africa. I said, you guys, I'm throwing my hands up here. I'm not finding Mr. Aquari, and I'd really like to. And they said, well, let us give it a shot. And a couple weeks later, they came back and said, you're not going to believe this, but we've tracked down Mr. Aquari's daughter, Josephine, in Dar es Salaam, and here's her contact information. And through her good graces and a lot of back and forth and figuring out where in Tanzania we could be somewhat close to Mr. Aquari, we made it happen. And I have to say, when this isn't in the book, but my gosh, when his daughter Josephine found out that he'd been on a motorcycle and in a car to get there and did the same thing going back, she was like, oh my God, my dad's 85. He did this. That's crazy. So that was a lot of fun, tracking him down, interviewing him, and writing about the whole experience.
What were some of the reactions when you said, hey, I'd like to tell your story of this thing that happened maybe decades ago?
Yeah. Well, I want to tell you about the guy who's in chapter 3, because I think he's an interesting reaction. His name is David Moorcroft, and he was a distance runner for Great Britain. And at the height of his career, there are household names in Britain like Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett and Steve Cram. Well, David Moorcroft was right there with him. And in 1982, he stepped on a track in Oslo, and he not only set a world record, he obliterated the old world record. But he was also a guy who was very slight of build, and he went through a lot of injuries as a distance runner. And in 1984 in Los Angeles, he had pelvic injuries. He was not himself. It was not a race that he wanted to think about or talk about for a long, long time. So when you talk about reactions, David Moorcroft's first reaction was, I didn't want to talk about Los Angeles for the longest time. And so going back to your earlier questions, I will always have a fond place in my heart for a guy who opened up about something that was difficult to talk about. And perspective and time gave him the ability to talk about it. And I was glad to be on the receiving end.
Yeah, that was a fun chapter to read. Hard, but
Yeah.
fun because it was that really special time and you hit so many Olympiads and sports and decades throughout. Did it ever get confusing in your head because you were obviously working on multiple chapters at the same time?
I was able to do it in a sequence, but I have to give a huge shout out to the woman who is my editor. She's a lady named Gail Kretschmer, and I thought she inevitably made this book better. And Gail was one of the people who said, you have some connecting threads here. You might want to think about not just writing these all in isolation, but having some cross references. And we did that a few times in the book because David Moorcroft and Gabrielle Anderson Shias, who I talked about a few minutes ago, were in the same Olympics. And Tom Hintonhouse was a pole vaulter who was deeply impacted by an Olympic boycott, but so was a sailor named Lawrence Lemieux later on in the book. And so we tried to do some of that cross connecting, but it didn't get too confusing for me, and I hope not too confusing for the readers.
What were the challenges in telling the story of somebody who had passed away versus somebody who is still alive?
Yeah, that was tough. I think there were a couple of athletes who fit into that category. There's one in chapter 10 of the book named Mel Wakabayashi, and he was a tremendous hockey and baseball player, and he was of Asian descent, and it was one of the reasons he went to Japan to play professional hockey and ultimately become the Japan national coach in 1980. But he died during the early interviewing and research on this book. I was able to do a written Q&A with him through his son in Japan. But that was a challenge, obviously, because I would have loved to have had detailed conversations with Mel and wasn't able to. So I had to rely on his sister and others in his inner circle. And then the other one that was very tough was an Australian sprinter named Peter Norman, who died back in 2006. So he died a long time ago, but there's a lot of parts of his story that remain very fresh and very sensitive for that country. And so the challenge was trying to tell that story in an even handed way because there are some very strong feelings on all sides of the Peter Norman issue.
At 1968 Mexico City,
Yes.
and he's the third person on that very famous podium.
Yeah.
What did you find about his story? And I thought that chapter was very interesting in terms of how he was viewed then versus how he was viewed now.
Well, we have to go back and think back to the times because, as you said, that was 1968 in Mexico City. And holy crap, 1968, folks, that's only a few years removed from Black people being told you can't drink from a water fountain, you can't sit in the front rows of a bus. You go to a different section of a restaurant. This one's whites only. And that wasn't just the United States, that was throughout many parts of the world. There was just this disparate treatment of those of Black color. And so for Peter Norman to do what he did in 1968 is pretty phenomenal. And I think I can think of very few athletes who would have been willing to step out and do it. But he had a Salvation Army upbringing. And the Salvation Army taught him that people are people. And that's how he looked at it. And so he did some very quiet, behind the scenes, but astounding things in 1968, I think. And so you fast forward to 2025, we're still having lots of difficult conversations about race relations in the United States and everywhere else. So that's what I think makes his story so phenomenal is if you go back and look at the times and think about what he did, and remember, you talk about people going to the Olympics and sometimes they have incentives to do things, and now even more so with sponsorships and the like. Peter Norman had no financial incentive to do what he did. In fact, he got some grief doing what he did in standing with two athletes who did a Black Power salute. So there wasn't anything for Peter to go, oh, if I do this, it'll work out really well for me when I go back to Melbourne, Australia. It wasn't like that. He did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. And that's a theme I really try and get into in the book because I think so many of these athletes fit it. They don't think of themselves as heroes. And to me, the really heroic people are the ones who don't do this stuff. You know, they don't do the pats on the back. They just do it because they thought it was the right thing to do. That's not just in sports, that's in everyday life. And I try and, when I do events, I try and help people with that cross tissue connection between Olympics and everyday life and how there are heroes everywhere if we just look a bit.
Well, and the Peter Norman story is also interesting in the way that we as Americans are very familiar with race issues in America, but they have their own race issues in Australia. And coincidentally, as we talk, today is the 20th anniversary of the opening of Sydney 2000, which made great efforts to incorporate the Aboriginal culture in that ceremony and in a way try to make up for some of the wrongs that have happened in there, just shedding light on the culture that was there before white people got there.
Yeah, very much so. And I tell people the story of Peter Norman and the reckoning that Australia went through. I think there are errors that are of malice and there are errors that are of omission. And I think what happened with Peter and the stance he took, I put that in the category of error of omission. I think Australia omitted the chance to recognize him and salute him right away. But over time and with efforts within the country and beyond, I feel like Australia deserves a lot of credit because they did recognize what Peter had done. They did acknowledge, you know what, we probably erred in not taking a greater recognition of this man beforehand. And, there was a resolution passed in their parliament. And if you go to downtown Melbourne where they have all their sports arenas, you'll find a statue of Peter Norman. And so, to Australia's great credit, they said, you know what, we erred here. We made a mistake, but we're going to come to terms with it and we're going to do something about it. And I always think in humanity, if you tell people you screwed up and you made a mistake and you want to do right, people give you a lot of grace.
So many of these stories have to do with pushing a body beyond its limit. You start off with that story of the runner that you mentioned running on a broken leg, and so many of these have injuries that are just wild. Were you ever going through these stories and you just wanted to ask the athlete, what were you thinking? Why didn't you stop? This is crazy.
Yeah. The one I love the most on that front, because there are so many athletes who fit that model, but there's a Canadian skier named Brian Stemmel. And Brian Stemmel almost died on a mountaintop in Austria. I mean, he was so close to dying. And it's a horrifically dangerous mountain to ski down. And, that guy was in a hospital bed with a 50-50 chance of whether he was going to make it. And the most fun part of writing that chapter was that I got to talk to his sister, Karen, who was also an Olympic skier before her brother. And I asked her that very question. What was this guy thinking getting back on the slopes? And she said she never would have done it. She made this motion. She said, that's what I would have done. I would have cut it off and gone on with the rest of my life. And that's what made his story so amazing to me is, look, this guy went to 4 Olympic Games and first 3, all kinds of setbacks. The fourth, he's 80% of the way to a gold medal. Again, read chapter 6 of Hero Redefined. I don't want to spoil it all, but Brian Stemmel's an example of a guy that, to me, the heroism of returning to the ski slopes and maybe the half craziness of returning to the ski slopes, right, is what makes his story so compelling.
Did he have the attitude of, why are you asking me this? Because why wouldn't I go back on the slopes?
Well, he's a guy who says, you know what, athletes get injured, and I didn't want the injury to get the better of me. I wanted to prove I could go back and do it. And here's where you guys, I think we get into the DNA of the elite athlete. You know, for so many of us, whether we're a decent athlete, a good athlete, a weekend warrior, you know, we go out, we exercise, and that's that. For the elite athlete who gets to an elite level, and remember, anybody who gets to the Olympics, I don't care what sport, you make it to the Olympics, you've done something phenomenal, because we're at a pinhead of how many people on the planet do that. I think there's something in the DNA that says, I will finish no matter what. I will beat injury no matter what. I will prepare and I will do my best no matter what. And there's a certain beauty in all of that, but it's also somewhat incomprehensible to the rest of us who don't go through that whole set of trials and tribulations and take that journey. So that's what makes it interesting, I think, to the rest of us to take a peek into the brainwaves, if you will.
The other aspect that I loved was so many of these stories are about good people being good. You know, you mentioned Peter Norman, Lawrence Lemieux is also in that category, Tracy Barnes. I'm just curious as to your reaction to those stories in terms of, I mean, obviously it made you feel better because it made me feel better as a reader, but just kind of those, wow, even in these moments, people can give up their own dreams to just be good people.
Yeah, it was heartwarming for me. And you mentioned Lawrence Lemieux and Tracy Barnes, and I'm just so impressed with those two as human beings. Forget the athlete part. Lawrence Lemieux was a Canadian sailor from the province of Alberta, which, if you look into the world of Canadian sailing, that's not where the big stars come from. They're normally from the east or west flanks of that country. And so, first of all, that guy fought against being from Alberta and went all over North America and drove thousands of miles in Econoline vans to compete wherever he could. This is a guy who thought of nothing but succeeding in the Olympic Games. And in 1988, he's on the cusp of it. And he's doing really well in a race, and he's going to be first or second. And he sees a head bobbing in the water. So after decades of thinking of nothing but the Olympics and how to succeed, he has those two sides of his brain pop up, right? And the better angel says, somebody's in real trouble adjacent to this sailing course. And the better angel in Lawrence Lemieux, in that snapshot of time, said, I better go help this guy. And you can debate, would that Singaporean sailor who he went and found, the guy named Joseph Chen, have been okay if Lawrence wouldn't have acted as he did? I think there's people in that chapter who said maybe not. And Joseph Chen himself, who reunited with Lawrence for a commercial, in front of a succeeding Olympic Games, he treated Lawrence Lemieux as the guy who made it happen and allowed him to live out his life. And so that's just a story about a human being at a moment in time when he's got to deciding on something that is innate human goodness. And Tracy Barnes is the other one, a biathlete from Colorado who was in a zone biathlon, by the way. And I learned a lot about it, but it's this incredible combination of skiing and shooting on the move at targets. And she was very proficient at it. And she, in 2014, was on her way to making the Winter Olympic team for Sochi. It came after she competed in 2006, but narrowly missed in 2010 and felt a little bitter about it. And she's getting ready to make the team, but there's a little problem. Her twin sister is hacking and coughing and dealing with a pretty significant upper respiratory infection. And Tracy Barnes could have just thought of herself and said, well, tough noogies, twin sis, I'm going to go to Sochi. I hope you can come watch me. That wasn't her thought process. Her thought process was, I feel so devastated for my twin sister, and she has so much potential. And my gosh, how do I make something happen for her? And you can read about, what Tracy Barnes went through to get there. But the part of the chapter I maybe love the most is I talked to Tracy and her twin sister Lanny and some of her coaches about my rhetorical question was, what if it had been someone not your twin sister? What if this athlete was named Lanny Jones or Lanny Smith instead of Lanny Barnes? Would you have done the same thing? And I very intentionally asked that question in isolation with all of them, and I didn't tell any of them what the others had said. All of them came to the conclusion that Tracy Barnes is the type of person who would have done the very same thing for someone who wasn't her twin sister. And so you talk about accolades for a human being. I don't know how it gets any better than that. So I get emotional here, but I think it's because Tracy Barnes is just an exceptional human being. And that's what I hope the readers get out of that chapter.
Well, I have to say I liked the Lawrence Lemieux story because we do history moments on the show, and every year is a different Olympics, and we covered Seoul 1988, and I had found his story with the rescue, and the whole sailing competition was just wild because of the weather and all of these things. But what he did was so amazing and just risky for himself too, to go and save somebody else. So I liked that chapter.
Me too. But it's funny. I go back to my point about these athletes and what they think of what they did. Lawrence Lemieux would debate you. If you brought him on this podcast, he'd debate you for an hour and tell you he did nothing special. And when you're a sailor and someone's in trouble, you're supposed to help them. And the people in his orbit would say, "Hey, Lawrence, time out, dude. It may work that way on a weekend when you find someone in a lake, but it doesn't necessarily work that way in Olympics when everybody's trying to get to a medal stand and do their very best and compete like hell because they work their asses off to get there." And that's what makes Lawrence more of a hero in my mind is he'll just tell you, and he'll tell you very definitively, I did what everyone else would have done. I don't agree, but it makes for a great story.
Do you have a favorite from the book?
I've been asked that question, and I liken it to the parent being asked to say who their favorite child is. I built up a love affair with all these athletes, and there are 2 chapters about non-athletes, people who had heroism in recruiting an Olympic Games and preserving an Olympic venue. So many of them touch my heartstrings that it's tough for me to have a favorite. I will say some of the ones we've talked about, they really rise to the top for me. And I probably need to leave it at that, but it's hard for me to pick a favorite.
Did you have any stories that you couldn't include in the book?
Yeah, that was the hard part. I ideally would have loved to write a few more chapters. There was an Irish gymnast who I found, and I found him through his gymnastics federation, but we never connected. And there was an African swimmer who had a fascinating story, and a United States and New Zealand distance runners who just perform the simple act of helping each other up. I love their story. For whatever reason, there were some athletes I couldn't connect with. So you'll find a chapter 14 in Hero Redefined. I call it the honor roll of others who I couldn't quite connect with, but I wanted to at least write a snippet about who they were and why I consider them heroic.
One more that I want to mention real quick is talking with, I'm going to probably butcher the name, Shanado Manovic from Bosnia Herzegovina,
That's
because when this interview comes out, we're going to be in the thick of Winter Olympics ahead of Milan Cortina, and we're going to get the inevitable look at these white elephant Olympic venues, and they always, always, always put in the Sarajevo luge track, which is not a white elephant on purpose. But how did you find this story, and how did you track him down?
that was just through my research. I learned about the efforts to restore the luge and bobsled track from Sarajevo. And when I started digging a little more, I found out about some of the volunteers who were leading that up. And Senad Omanovic was at the head of the line. And I loved getting to know him and interviewing him and his daughter Sabina, who was our translator for the interview. He's just a wonderful guy who just said, you know what, we had this state of the art track. And then after the Olympics, we had years of war and bloodshed. And Mount Trebovich was a hub of all the fighting and decimation. And this guy said, that's not going to be the end of the story for this track. I'm not going to let that happen, not on my watch. And I thought, wow, how cool is that? That this guy, again, with really nothing to gain from this except the pride of his city and his country and wanting the story to end in a better way than with war and decimation, decides I'm going to just about kill myself to get that track restored, and gets help from the Olympic committees, and has some former athletes and coaches come over and talk to him, and hooks up with a member of parliament. This guy was just steadfast in his belief that there had to be something better for that track. And I love the story of his dogged efforts. He is a guy who just never gave up and never accepted the word no.
He sounds like the kind of guy who would be like, Doug, let me tell you this. We don't do this in Bosnia. He would be one of those characters, just like, Doug, no, let me tell you something, Doug.
Well,
This is not.
well, that's true, but I have to say there's another heroic person in this, and that's his wife. I mean, Sabina said, there were times my dad wanted to give up, and my mom said, no, you're going to keep
You
at it, buddy.
started this. Wait, there's got to be a wooden spoon in there. You started this, you finish it.
That's right.
Did not put up with this for all these years to say, no, we finish it.
Absolutely.
I'm suddenly envisioning the Bosnian equivalent of a chancla. Do you know the Latina slipper that the mother throws at you? I'm imagining Sabina has that equivalent.
And for me, it was not only learning about Senad and his story. I learned about Bosnia and Herzegovina and what a gorgeous city Sarajevo is, and Mount Trebovich, and they have this tram you can go up, and it looks like just an epic country to visit. Not, again, one of those under the radar countries, right? It's not Italy or France, but I hope one day to get to that city, and I know I'd have someone willing to host me. So that was a fun learning process for me as well.
What's next for Doug?
Well, I have some other ideas in my brain. I'm not ready to go public with them, but I have several book ideas. I've been asked, do you want to write another book? And for a while, I wasn't ready to answer that question. After you've spent 2 years birthing something, you just need to sit back and sort through. But I feel like I have something else to say, and I have several ideas, and some of them involve sports and some of them don't. And my very best advisor in the world is my wife. So I tend to run my ideas through her because she's smarter than I am, for one thing. So I figure that's a good place to start.
Has writing this book changed how you watch sports, and specifically how you're watching the Olympics?
Yeah, it does. I've always been a huge fan of the Olympics, but it has. I found myself looking at, gee, what are the stories behind the stories? And one of the fun parts of the book is the production company I worked with helped set up a website for me and said, you should write a regular blog. And so if you go to author Doug Levy, all one word.com, you'll find out all kinds of things about Hero Redefined, and you can see, media things I've done, but you can also find a regular blog. And so in that blog, I've posted about some athletes who I think, had I been writing this book, including the most recent Olympics, who might I have written about? There's a a British gymnast named Becky Downey, who I think is a wonderful story. And then there's an American gymnast named Brody Malone. And in his perfect world, he'd be one of those medal winners on the Wheaties box, but didn't work out that way. But he had a definite hand in helping the USA win a bronze medal. You know, he wasn't the guy with the Superman Clark Kent lookalike status who did the pommel horse, but he did some things behind the scenes to make it possible.
How can people get the book?
So, if anybody wants to read Hero Redefined, I'd be honored. The book is available if you just Google Hero Redefined, Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Goodreads.com, you'll find it. And again, if you go to authordouglevy.com, you can get the book that way. And it's available at most bookstores. So I hope people will give it a shot, and I hope they'll enjoy the stories as much as I enjoyed researching and telling them.
Excellent. Well, Doug, thank you so much for being on, and we really appreciate it and really enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much, Doug. You can find out more about Doug at authordouglevy.com. On Instagram, he is doug.levy.author. Facebook, he is Doug Levy Author, and he is also on LinkedIn at Douglas Levy. We will have links to all of those in the show notes. You can get the book, which it was a good book. I really enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed and really surprised at how many of these that I didn't know or remember. And that was fun.
Yes, you can get that at your favorite place to buy books, which we hope is through our bookshop.org site at bookshop.org/shop/flamealivepod. If you purchase anything through that link and Doug's book is on our list of featured authors who have been on the show, we get a commission from that. That greatly helps our efforts to keep this show going, as well as get to Milano to bring the Winter Olympics and Paralympics to you.
Ah, la torta.
The cake. Good thing you're training me on that word now, right?
Biscotti e la torta.
All right, we have some news from Milano Cortina 2026. And just a note, because usually we tape on the Wednesday before the show comes out. Today we are taping on Friday, October 10th. So I have a bunch of family stuff I got to do at the beginning of next week, and taping doesn't fit into the program. But luckily we do have some news. So if more news comes out and you're like, why didn't they talk about that? It's because future Jill and Alison will have to deal with extra news next week. And that's okay. But there are more tickets for sale.
I know. What is tickets? Billetes.
Bilete.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's Spanish. Biletas.
It's close because you've
It's
said
close.
the word on the show
Yes.
before.
Okay. Of course I did.
Anyway, the Milan Cortina organizing committee has released more tickets for sale for select sports, which include biathlon, cross-country skiing, freestyle, men's ice hockey, Nordic combined, snowboarding, ski jumping, and speed skating.
Oh, that's a lot of good sports in there.
Yes, a lot of good sports. Biathlon will have more Category C tickets starting at €50. And my guess is that if Category C is the lowest level, that's probably you get to kind of wander around the track a little bit and watch them ski. Men's ice hockey will have Category C tickets starting at €30. Not bad.
I mean, even if it's early rounds, you're still going to see NHL players because, as we talked about a couple months ago, every team has NHL players on it, I think, except Italy.
Well, that'll be fun to watch. Tickets can be purchased with your Visa card, remember. I'm hoping that by this time, people will remember that you can only use Visa. You can get those at tickets.milanocortina2026.org, and all tickets will be digital. Those souvenir tickets will be available for purchase when you make your ticket purchase. So if you want one of those, they're pretty cheap. They're only €2.99 per ticket plus delivery. You can only pretty much get them at the time you buy the tickets if it's the same deal as Paris. So don't get some FOMO if you get your tickets. Speaking of Nordic combined tickets, FIS, the International Federation, reports that 64% of Nordic combined tickets have sold. And they say in their news release, quote, underscoring the strong spectator interest, end quote. And if they release more tickets for Nordic Combined, and Nordic Combined has only sold 64%, even though that is strong interest. Like, are people going to come out of the woodwork to come see these sports?
No.
Yeah, I mean, like hockey and speed skating, I can get because you've got a whole city of people to draw from that would probably be like, oh, there's this Olympics on. That sounds kind of fun.
And also for the Milan events, you could see 2 events in a day. You could go see a hockey game and then go over and see speed skating.
Yes.
These alpine events, and I say alpine meaning in the mountains, not actually alpine skiing, it's gonna be really tough to see more than one event just because everything is
Right.
so far away. We don't have good transportation information, and even what we do have doesn't look great.
Yes. So we're talking about Nordic Combined specifically because the IOC will decide on the future of the sport in the Olympic program later in the spring. So they really need to have that stadium full in order to like bolster their argument to keep it in the games. Per NBC Los Angeles, we know that the opening ceremony is going to be at San Siro Stadium in Milano, but organizers said there's going to be a smaller event in Cortina. And Italian Olympic Committee President Luciano Buonfiglio told RAI State Radio that there will be male and female flag bearers in each location for a total of 4 flag bearers.
But some of these teams don't even have 4 athletes.
Well, maybe they'll have
volunteers.
the volunteers or officials if they're split up, but at least the people the athletes in Cortina will have some kind of ceremony that they can go to, and they don't have to worry about getting back and forth because that's just if you're curling, you're not going. Whatever sliding event is right away, whatever alpine skiing event is right away, you're not going. Same with biathlon. You're just not going to go to the event. Having one there will be a little bit nicer for you. There will also be 2 cauldrons. So there will be one in Milano, and it will be at the Arco della Pace, which is a big arch. And the Cortina one will be in the central Piazza di Bona. I'm curious to see what these look like.
Hopefully we'll be able to get a train to see the other one.
Right. Milano Cortina also announced its athlete-focused mental health initiative, including a cyber abuse protection system, a mind zone at the village, a mentally fit 24/7 helpline, and welfare officers. I would like to say that we would have our own cyber abuse protection system, which is don't do it, or we'll have a conversation with you. And you don't want to have a conversation with me.
Can you imagine, like, here's what we need for the Milano cyber protection. We need a whole bunch of nonas.
Yeah, right?
Outside the windows going, don't do that. What? Don't do that. And they will listen. Because there's always, if you've ever been into any Little Italy in any big city in the United States, they're still to this day, the nonas hang out the window. And I love them because they watch your car. And nobody is going to cyberbully when Nona's watching you because she's going to hit you in the back of the head with either a wooden spoon or a slipper.
Right? So there you go. Don't do it. We have a little bit of U.S.-focused news because this is exciting. WXXI News has news from USA Bobsled. So who is back as a sponsor? The Eastman Kodak Company is sponsoring Team USA's new sled. It's Kodak's first time back in the Olympic sponsorship world since Beijing 2008. Also interesting is that Kodak designed and sponsored Team USA sled for the 1956 Olympics in Cortina d'Ampezzo, which is our games history moment games for next year. Boom, I'm so excited about bobsled.
But now you took the lead from the bobsled story for next year.
Well, I mean, something to look forward to is like, how did that happen?
But yeah, that Eastman Kodak, number one, I'll be honest, didn't realize it was still an independent company. I thought it got bought by somebody.
Mm.
And that it still wants to be in this game.
Well, they got some design chops. I'm not sure if they just sponsored this sled or if they had a hand in design, but their logo slap on the front of the sled. So welcome back, Kodak. And according to The Athletic, NBC Sports announced its ice hockey broadcast team for Milano Cortina 2026. Kenny Albert will be back doing play-by-play for both men's and women's hockey. He will be joined by Eddie Olczyk for the men's games with Brian Boucher as the Inside the Glass reporter. On the women's side, AJ Maletzko will be in the booth, and three-time Canadian gold medalist Jennifer Botterill will be the analyst starting in the quarterfinal round. And then there's additional play-by-play duties that will be helmed by Brendan Burke and Chris Vosters, and Anson Carter, TJ O'Shea, and Angela Ruggiero will be the other analysts.
I'm so glad you handled all those names. Hockey always has such great names, and I know a lot of these names, and this is going to be fun. I think
Oh,
I'm
it
going to be
is.
recording a lot of NBC hockey to go back and watch once we get home.
Yeah, we're gonna have to figure out how to watch some Peacock, get around the geographic things. Because Kenny Albert's been doing play-by-play for hockey for a long time, Olympic hockey. So welcome back, Kenny Albert. It's always fun to have like the team that you know and remember from games to games.
And have the history themselves and can talk about how this tournament is different. Obviously, this is going to be a very different tournament than it's been the past, for the men especially, than the past two Olympics.
Mm-hmm. We have some news from LA 2028. Google is now a founding partner of LA 2028. They plan to, quote, deliver a more personal and interactive experience for Olympic and Paralympic Games athletes and spectators, no matter where or how you follow Team USA in Milano Cortina and the LA 2028 Games in the US. Maybe they're going to have extra fun stuff, extra Google Doodles.
Maybe they'll have a thought bubble above everyone's head telling them what they should think.
I love it. Well, it's funny because they're like, oh, we're bringing cutting edge AI technology. Dude, in 3 years, what is technology going to be like? You can't even probably begin to describe what we'll be using AI for then. Although I'm sure there's some people going, oh, yeah, well, we know because we're doing the AI. But anyway, so Google will now be a big name in the Olympic space. We have a little bit of news from the International Olympic Committee. Listener Mark posted a story from Variety in the Facebook group that the IOC has signed a multi-year licensing deal with Sega video games systems, but the initial effort is a program called Five Rings that seems to be mainly Olympics-themed artwork that has been turned into merch.
Which means Sonic the Hedgehog is in all 5 ring colors, which is actually really cool.
It's cute stuff, but the listeners in the Facebook group were like, please bring a game back. Please, let's have a game.
And there's so many different ways that they could, just talking about AI, could distribute that game. It's not the old school cassette that you put in the machine. It's because Sega was really good at that.
I'm sorry. Was there like an LA-84 Atari game?
I don't know if there was
talking
an
cassettes.
LA-84. Well, yeah, but even later, even still by 96, you were still putting things into a machine, weren't you?
Yeah, but I mean, 96 was a while ago. I mean,
Yeah,
I've
but
got a
what I was
PlayStation 2 and it's got DVDs.
I was referring to the 96 Sonic the Hedgehog.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. I'm sorry. I'm more ignorant about the video game space, except for the Torino 2006 one that I own. That makes you feel like crap every time you play it because the announcers are so mean.
Kenny Albert would never.
No. But I mean, like, the listeners have a point with bring a video game back because, hey, you're doing the esports games. Why is there no big esport Olympic game coming out with that? Right?
Seems obvious, right? But maybe
Does
there's a
seem
reason.
obvious.
Maybe there's a reason.
Somebody said in the Facebook group, the great thing about the games is once you have Olympic fever and you're like, after the games are over, I have the video game to play to make me happy. And IOC, if you are listening, you want people to think about the Olympics long, long after they're gone. It's a good way to keep them engaged. That's all I have to say about that.
Welcome to Shekflastan.
It is the time of the show where we check in with our team, Keep the Flame Alive. These are past guests and listeners of our very own country, Shekflastan. I wanted to start with weightlifter Hampton Morris because he took bronze in the men's 65 kilogram category at the World Weightlifting Championships, which is awesome, Hampton. But I wanted to say a note. This is a new weight class for him because at Paris 2024, he was in the 61 kilograms. And then this year, the IWF shifted the weight classes again, like they like to do. And our friends over at Weightlifting House said that when the IOC opted to put weightlifting back on the program for LA, the IWF thought it would get more weight classes along with that. But no, they still have 5 weight classes. At Paris, they were 61, 73, 89, 102, and over 102. And this is for the men. The LA categories haven't been announced yet, but the IWF reworked the 8 weight classes it currently competes in. So 3 weight classes get shafted come Olympic time. So now they have reworked their 8 weight classes to be 60, 65, 71, 79, 88, 94, 110, and over 110. So Hampton he could have gone from 61 to 60, which is hard, we know, working your way down.
And it's not like he wasn't lean to begin with. I mean, all weightlifters they teeter on the edge of whatever weight class they're in.
Right.
So to drop down even another kilo.
Right. So he went up to 65, which may be more comfortable from him. I'm curious to know if that's a more comfortable weight. And hopefully that will be one that gets selected for LA. Good on you doing well in a situation where you have to either try to lose a kilo or gain 4 more kilos and still perform at the world champs.
Team Schuster is competing in the St. Paul Cash Spiel. And I'm so glad I got through that. I thought that was going to be the reportage of this week. Shooter Kim Rohde is in Greece competing at the ISSF World Championship in women's skeet. And speaking of weightlifting, Bobby Body is in Cairo competing in the Powerlifting World Championships.
And superfan Sarah went to the new exhibit Game Changer, United by Sport at the George W. Bush Presidential Library and sat down with us to tell us what it's like. Take a listen. Superfan Sarah, welcome back to the show. You know, it's been a long time, it feels like, since we saw you in Paris. How have you been?
Oh, goodness. We've been good. Yeah, still following all the Olympic and Paralympic sports that we can, as everyone who's a fan is. We're getting ready to watch the upcoming Winter Olympics and Paralympics, and we talked about this a little bit ago, but trying to figure out, are we going to be in Italy? Are we just going to bring back the giant patent Olympic party? You know, we haven't done that since Tokyo. So we're still figuring that out, but we're excited that we will be entering an Olympic year very soon.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And ahead of that, you are members at the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and they have a new exhibit that involves Olympic stuff.
Yes. The disclaimer is I live in Richardson, which is just north of Dallas and about 20 minutes away from the George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum. And my husband and I have been members there for, well, really since it opened. We were gifted a membership and just keep renewing it because they do a lot of educational events. And so the disclaimer is that it's very non-political and very non-partisan. They do, of course, have a museum about his presidency, but a lot of the events and the exhibits they do are very non-partisan. They have incredible speakers that come in. We've been there for events with Jay Leno. They did a screening of the 30 for 30, which was about President Bush throwing out the first pitch at the World Series after 9/11. We've seen Lorne Michaels there. So the disclaimer for me is that it's a pretty nonpartisan membership to be part of, to have a membership at the library, if you will. So that being said, they do have a new exhibit called Game Changers. And a couple weeks ago, we went to a special preview night where there was an interview that they did, which I did discover is now on YouTube. Very great conversation. with Joe Buck. And then if you are a listener of this show, you probably recognize the other guest who was there by the name of Bob Costas. And no, he did not. Yes, he did not have pink eye.
Poor Bob will never live down Sochi 2014. Really.
I kept waiting for something to be said about it. And I think I did submit a question that did not make it to the stage. But the question that I submitted was, did you have any moments that you look back and laugh about, or kind of a blooper, kind of hoping that that might come up, but we never heard about the pink eye. So that was a great conversation. But then the exhibit, Game Changers, is also incredible and full of sports mementos, but does talk about the Olympics and the Paralympics.
What kind of stuff do they mean when they talk about Game Changer? How do they explore that theme?
So Game Changer, it's called Game Changer United by Sports, and it is in 3 sections. The sections are Rallying the Team, which explores some of President Bush's presidency. They do have a part of that involving the 9/11 pitch that I mentioned a while ago. They talk about Little League games that he held at the White House, because President Bush was is a huge baseball fan. He used to own or be a partial owner of the Texas Rangers. So if you know anything about President Bush and sports, it's baseball for him. And so they talk about team sports having an impact. And in that section for Rallying the Team, they have an Olympic torch from 1980, and they talk about the Miracle on Ice. So that's a team focus. The second section is called Leveling the Playing Field. And I thought this exhibit was really cool because they talk about Jim Thorpe, they talk about Vicki Draves, Jackie Robinson, and it really focuses on athletes who have been trailblazers. There's a little footnote about Catherine Switzer finding a way to be in the Boston Marathon. Now, I'm going to blast my husband a little bit because there's a picture of her that famous picture where she's being taken off the Boston Marathon course. And he was like, they removed her? Why did they do that? And so I, as a sports fanatic and as a woman, I am ashamed of myself that my husband did not know that whole story.
Well, fear not. We have an episode for that. When we talked to Stephen Lane about his book. So Nick, it's okay. We will take care of you.
Yes. But the reason that I bring that little anecdote up is that there is so much content there that even if you would consider yourself a big sports fan, which my family, we are all sports fans, my husband included, there's still something for everybody to learn. There is even a little picture in there of Jason Collins, who was the first NBA basketball player to come out. So they focus on people who have broken barriers racially, with LGBTQ rights. They talk about Simone Biles in 2021 and taking a step back and focusing on mental health. There's also a snippet in there about Title IX and the impact of Title IX, the history of Title IX, how it came to be. And of course, since we're in Texas, there is a little video that plays specifically about how Title IX has impacted universities in the state of Texas. So I thought that was cool. But my highlight of the Leveling the Playing Field exhibit is that they have a prosthetic leg from Melissa Stockwell, who we love. Yes. Something about Melissa Stockwell, if you know much about her and her relationship with President Bush. So she lost her leg in 2004, and I believe they met at Walter Reed or somewhere, and they have had this friendship that has really grown over the years. When the when the library opened, he had Melissa Stockwell come and say the pledge at the grand opening. And he made it a point to introduce her to every living president, talking about how sports can be unifying. She has participated. He does warrior bike rides where he has wounded veterans come to his ranch and they do bike rides. And so he has really celebrated her and her accomplishments. So they have a prosthetic there that she used in one of her competitions. It doesn't say which Paralympics or if it was the Paralympics, but it's definitely one of hers. On a side note, President Bush loves Melissa. He actually painted a portrait that was on display at the library a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
And he
Holy
featured
cow.
her in his book, Portraits of Courage. So I thought about that when thinking about her.
And was it the red, white, and blue?
Yes.
Yes. 'Cause
Yeah,
that's
and
what she's become known for in that prosthetic that has the American flag on it.
the final section of the exhibit is about sports being unifying in the global arena. I think they have a program and a table tennis paddle from, they call it ping pong diplomacy.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And they have a video that plays explaining what ping pong diplomacy was. And I thought that was really cool. For anyone that's not familiar with that, the United States table tennis team was at World Championships in, I think, 1971. And they were in Japan. And Mao Zedong came over to Japan and said, I want you to come to China, because he was tired of China being shut out from the world, specifically the United States. So they set up a table tennis match in China. They had thousands of spectators come, and ultimately building that friendship among the table tennis teams led to President Nixon coming to China in 1972, which paved the way for better relations with the United States and China. So they focus a lot on how sports actually can change the world. There is a video that plays, as well as a write-up about Michelle Kwan, who under President Biden was an ambassador to Belize. They talk about Shaquille O'Neal going to Cuba to do basketball camps and how that helped bridge some relations with Cuba and the United States. My favorite part of the global arena section was they focus a lot on the relationship that Jesse Owens had with Les Long, which many Olympic fans are familiar with that story of Les Long helping Jesse overcome when he was competing in the long jump, figuring out how to jump the right way and not get disqualified at the 1936 Olympics. One of the coolest things is that they have an Olympics pennant that Les signed for Jesse. They also have Jesse Owens medals on display and a lot of things from his private collection.
And Les Long being German and competing for Nazi Germany and ultimately dying as a soldier in World War II on the German side. But they stayed in touch. That is one of those stories, if you don't know, it's one of those great moments in Olympic history that we absolutely want to keep alive.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for adding that context that he was German, because by all accounts, they should not have been friends. And especially to do it in front of Hitler in his Olympics, trying to show off how great the German athletes were. And here is this Black American who ends up taking the gold. An incredible and inspiring story. So yeah, a side note to that is that when we went to the event where Joe and Bob talked, Joe Buck shared a story. So if you don't know much about Joe Buck, his dad is a legendary broadcaster who passed away a while back. But by his dad being a broadcaster, he met a lot of famous athletes. And so Joe Buck was, I think he said 8, 9 years old. And Jesse, I think, came to their home, or he met Jesse Owens, and his dad made sure to get a signed picture for Joe Buck as a kid. And Joe talked about how impactful that was for him, that in his home, he has a sports room with, tons of memorabilia, where that's just going to be inevitable when you have that kind of career. But he said that the picture of Jesse Owens, he keeps framed in his living room because he wants to see it every day. And it's one of the most proud mementos that he has. So it was cool to hear him talk about that and just the impact and the legacy. One of the other cool Olympic things that they have on display is Brendan Morrow, who is a legendary Dallas Stars hockey player. He is not American, though. He played for the Canadian team. And so they have his gold medal from the Vancouver Olympics there. And then they talk about how, and this is relevant to Dallas, but also several cities in all of the United States in general for the next year. They talk about trying to use the World Cup for diplomacy because the World Cup is coming. And Dallas is one of the featured cities where the World Cup will take place. So I think that that might be kind of what inspired them to do this exhibit, because we're getting ready to welcome the nations to the United States. And I don't want to get into should this happen, should this not happen, but we've heard President Trump talk about, is Putin going to come to the World Cup? And so I think that that's a very good example of leaders using sports as an avenue to engage with other leaders from around the world.
Well, it sounds like they did an amazing job not making it just about Texas or just even about the United States, that it really seems to run the gamut of sports and athletes and countries and stories, which is wonderful.
Yeah, they do have at the end, they bring it home with Dallas sports teams. They have featured athletes like Nastia, since she's from here, and they talk about the Texas Rangers. So if you are a Texas sports fan, you'll also find local things that you like and just about the history of Dallas sports in general. But they did a great job, like you said, and it wasn't just about the United States. It was about the impact of sports on the global stage. And then while I was there, something that I can sometimes forget whenever I go to these events is in the main exhibit, and this is just something that's there all the time, is that they have a torch from the Salt Lake City Games from 2002. And they talk about President Bush meeting with some of the people who ran the torch on the relay in 2002 who had lost loved ones in the 9/11 attacks, which kind of goes back to the first pitch of the World Series, where when you think about the 2001, 2002, that whole era and President Bush and how significant it was that he put himself among the athletes at the Olympic Games, how he was, I'm going to go throw this first pitch and I'm going to be surrounded by the Secret Service, and that's okay, but I'm going to do this to show that I'm not afraid. And so the impact of his leadership at that time on sports is pretty significant.
Shared with me a story from the Bob Costas talk about the Atlanta 1996 cauldron lighting. Mm-hmm. What did Bob say?
Yeah, so they asked him, I think it may have been his favorite sports moment or maybe specifically Olympics moment, but they asked him about one of the most significant memories that he had during his time of being around the Olympics. And he talked a little bit about Muhammad Ali and how divisive and polarizing he was, which, not growing up in that era where he was at the peak of his fame, that is just something I've read about, but hearing him talk about it was very insightful. And how the whole not going into the draft during the war. And so there were some people that hated him and there were some people that still liked him. And so that kind of set the tone for this story, which was the 1996 Olympics. And we all remember seeing the footage of Muhammad Ali being the surprise guest at the end who was going to light the cauldron. But that was such a well-kept secret that only a handful of people knew. And they wanted it to be that way so that the broadcasters would have a real reaction to what they were seeing. People knew that Ali had been struggling with Parkinson's, and they just didn't know how this was going to go. Apparently, they did, I think it was, and Jill, you might remember from the clip I sent you, like a 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. rehearsal or something, the middle of the night, because they didn't want anybody to see this. And it was Janet Evans who handed Muhammad Ali the torch. And in this rehearsal, he actually dropped the torch. And so that amped up the anxiety for the people who were in the know of, is this going to work out? Is it not going to work out? And then, as we know, he nailed it. And we also know that in that moment, it was so unifying for people who had been so upset with him for all these years, and seeing him with Parkinson's, this guy who has a struggle, who has been one of the greatest athletes in American history, to get up and to be shaking and to say, here I am, you can see me, I'm not perfect, I'm not Superman. And here I am. That was such an impactful moment. And that people went from hating him and just thinking he's the worst, that there was a newfound amount of respect for him for being willing to put himself out there. But yeah, I had not heard that story before, that he had dropped the torch in a rehearsal. And I'm so glad that that did not happen during the actual opening ceremony.
But that clip was interesting because when Bob was telling that story, because he found out from Janet Evans the scoop, and Ali was like, "I will get it together, and don't worry, I'm going to do this," and he did, and it's just I do tear up just even thinking about it, and I know how I'm going to spend half my afternoon is watching that torch relay, because it's for me. I mean, there are a lot of spectacular cauldron lightings, but that is one of the biggest, most emotional ones. I think
we have the context.
Yeah.
We, as Americans and Americans of a certain age, it really hits home. And doesn't that say exactly who he was as an athlete? That didn't frighten him, that he wasn't worried about letting the world see him sick. He was like, I'm going to get it together, and you can trust in Ali. I can imagine that conversation, right?
Yes. It was really cool to hear that story. And they talk about this a little bit in the exhibit, but also in the conversation that Joe and Bob had. They talked about the miracle on ice and how in that moment, when you are rooting for a team, so the miracle on ice is very, because of the Cold War, because of everything going on, everyone was USA, USA. We know that. But when you are rooting for a sports team, and this is the part that they try to really hit home about being unified by sport. When you are in those crowds and you're high-fiving the people around you, you're not thinking, did you dodge a draft? Did you vote Republican? Did you vote Democrat? What's your socioeconomic status? And how those moments truly can be unifying. And that's part of what makes them so beautiful. And this is where I think everyone should love sports, but that's my very biased opinion.
Which is why we love you, Sarah. We welcome and encourage biased opinions on this show.
Oh, well, Superfan Sarah, thank you so much for checking out the exhibit for us and going to the opening night stuff. And the exhibit lasts through January 10th, 2027. Wow, it's on for a long time.
Yeah, so you've got time.
Yeah.
And anybody who shows up here and wants a buddy to go to the exhibit with, contact me, because I love a good time.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's always great to have you on the show. And you know what else is great? Our reviewer comment of the week.
So this is from our Facebook group, Keep the Flame Alive podcast group, and from listener Sarah. Loved our interview with Dr. Timus Rietveld. Always glad when people go for these geeky interviews. And we then had a conversation how if the two of us were in charge, this would become a wheelchair rugby show. But what I did want to mention was she also said, really appreciate what Alison and Jill create on the regular.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate you. And if you would like to hear your name here in this segment, leave us a review on your podcast app or check out the other ways to get in touch with us in the episode details. And that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening.
And until next time, keep the flame alive.